Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Hi, I'm Paul Lancaster. Thanks for watching. The subject is trees, specifically remarkable trees of Virginia, the topic of a new book by a couple of folks. Jeff Kirwan is a forestry professor here at Virginia Tech and extension specialist. Nancy Ross Hugo is an outdoor writer and co-author of the book. And Robert Llewellyn took the fabulous photographs. I want to give him certainly the credit that is due. And Jeff, let me kind of start out how the whole idea of keeping track of our trees got started.
Well, I guess it's fair to start it with the American Forests, which is a conservation organization in Washington, D.C. Back in the 30s, they invited states to submit their largest trees that they could find in an effort to bring attention to them and hopefully preserve them. And Virginia joined in that effort in 1970 as a 4-H project, a search to find the largest trees. And this project was an outgrowth of that. Nancy approached me, 4 years ago now, and commented that the big trees sometimes leave out other trees. Sometimes the biggest tree of a species is kind of a freak of nature, and there are more beautiful, more significant trees out there that have historic and cultural significance, and maybe old trees.
Well, Nancy, what drew you to the idea of doing a book about this?
Well, I've been a tree person for a long time. I think they are the best, highest and best representations of nature. And I'd been very interested in the big tree program. I think everybody is because they're the superlative trees. But as Jeff said, it's really true that sometimes the champions are big, but they might not be beautiful and they might not be the most inspirational trees. So we decided we wanted to include not just the champions, which are the biggest, but historic trees, community trees, some unique trees, even noteworthy species, because some species are more interesting. Instead of having one specimen tree, they're interesting because in repetition they're gorgeous, things like dogwoods and redbuds. So we actually have 10 categories and tried to find about 100 trees that were the best representatives of those categories.
And Jeff, of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the trees that were nominated for this process, wasn't it?
Oh yes, we set up a website and invited the public to nominate trees in their own words and their own pictures. And we received about 1,000 nominations there, and we probably had at least as many big trees that were nominated over the time period. So I would guess we had well over 2,000 trees that were nominated to us.
I want to show off some of the pictures in the books. I want to go through some of the categories. We may not get to them all. I want to start out with old trees, because there's an example of trees that are not necessarily spectacular, but they're obviously old. And an example are the red cedars up in Giles County. Jeff, talk about those.
Well, those trees are remarkable because they're also very small. And it makes a good point, which Nancy did a wonderful job of describing in the text, that large trees are not necessarily big, and big trees are not necessarily old, and you can't really judge a tree's age by its size. Those red cedars in the book, I believe, are only about 6 inches in diameter, and yet they're believed to be around 500 years old, based on some tree ring work that were done on trees in the same area, growing on these cliffs. It's just a harsh environment, so the tree makes very little growth from year to year, but that also makes it easy to support itself over a long period of time.
I know bald cypresses in Southampton County are generally old, and bald cypresses in general there's some really fascinating pictures in the book about bald cypresses. Can you talk about those, Nancy?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, the oldest trees in Virginia that have been dated are bald cypresses on the Blackwater River. They were dated by a geoscientist from the University of Arkansas, and we know they're trees in the Blackwater Swamp that are 833 years old, and Dr. Staley suspects that there are probably 1,000-year-old trees in that swamp. And then on the Nottoway, which has been called parts of the Nottoway have been called the Lost Forest because it was within the last 5 years that some incredibly interesting trees, and the largest, what was, and as we feature in our book, as the largest tree in the state, a bald cypress, is in the on the Nottoway. Just strange trees shaped like teepees, and trees shaped like tea kettles, and trees shaped like lobsters. There are lots of, not in addition to bald cypresses, there are lots of water tupelos in there that have really interesting shapes.
Mm-hmm. So, and some of those trees may indeed be older, but they're hollow on the inside, so we'll never know for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, to paraphrase you, old trees are not necessarily historic, and historic trees are not necessarily old. And there's some interesting historic trees, and two I want to mention specifically. One is the Emancipation Oak in Hampton. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, that drew my attention because I was the one that received the nominations as they came in on the web and through the mail. And that was the single most nominated tree in Virginia. More people nominated that independent of each other than any other tree. So that really struck me right away. It's on the campus of Hampton University. And when you go to Hampton University to look for this tree, it doesn't matter who you stop and ask, they all know the tree. And that's not often the case when you go hunting for trees. So we were impressed not by just the number of nominations, but by the sheer love, shared love of this tree with everybody on campus. The tree is historically significant because it's the site of the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation in the South. And Nancy's done some wonderful bit of digging into this tree, and the history is really very fascinating. There are lots of exceptions to the Emancipation Proclamation that most people don't realize, and it was read in the South, but it was on Union-controlled land, I believe, and if you want the details, ask Nancy. But it's a great tree, great historic significance.
Well, Nancy, I want to ask more of a broader question in terms of trees becoming part of the community, and there's a separate chapter on community trees, but this is an example of how a tree defines a place, and that happens a lot in Virginia, and in this book, doesn't it?
It does. If you just think of there's some trees that are just familiar visual features of the community. Everybody says, turn left at the walnut on the corner, that kind of thing. I'm remembering one nomination we got that I loved. It said a whole 15 cousins have been fighting to save this tree. You probably remember which tree that was. I can't remember.
It's a black walnut here in Montgomery County.
It was wonderful.
A mile of cousins.
A mile of cousins have been fighting to save that tree. That's right. But there's some trees that the community just relates to. Two of the community trees that I really like in our book, I like them all, but two that I particularly appreciated. One is the tricycle tree in Ashland, which happens to be my hometown. It has the wheel of an antique tricycle embedded in its branches, almost 20 feet off the ground. And it's been there since 1908 when some boys had a tree house in the tree, and they used the rim of the tricycle as a pulley to pull things up to their tree house. And actually that tree was damaged in July of this past year, and now Randolph-Macon and a committee of community people are trying to find a way to save that part of the tree and put it in the library and maybe write a children's book about it. But there's a lot of Ashland history tied up in that tree, because the child who put the trike up there eventually became a Randolph-Macon professor, and not to mention it's a gorgeous willow oak. So,
back on history,
Yeah.
The other tree I specifically wanted to ask you about, Jeff, is Sally's crying tree in Marion. That's a heck of a story.
Yes, and it's difficult for me to tell because it's a very emotional story for me, and I think just about anybody who comes into contact with Evelyn Lawrence, who tells the story. And Evelyn is a retired school teacher in a small town in Southwest Virginia called Marion, which used to be called Royal Oaks, and this is one of their beautiful oaks that they still have in the town. But Evelyn tells the story of her grandmother, Sally Adams, who was, as a slave, was sold at the auction block along with the rest of her family. And the rest of the family was sold to a distant landowner. So she was left by herself in this town, and since she had no family, she adopted the tree as her sole family member, and she would go to the tree at night and cry. And I particularly love this story because I think every school child should know that if they need to, there are trees they can adopt.
Yeah.
We have lots of trees that were nominated that were trees that provided solace to people. It's an interesting connection.
Well, there are a lot of trees out there that weren't nominated that provide a lot of solace too, I think.
Right.
I wanted to talk about the idea of champion trees a little bit. Do we have an idea how many champion trees Virginia has total, different types of species of trees?
Oh yes, it's well over 500. We many states and at the national level they only recognize the native and the naturalized trees that have become established once they've been planted. But in Virginia we try to recognize every species, whether it's native, naturalized, or non-native and non-naturalized, and so we have quite a few.
I think we have 26 trees that are also national champs.
Yes, and
right?
we're fifth in the country. There are 4 states that have more national champions than us, so we're quite proud of that.
And I think some people have a misconception about champion trees. Well, it's the tallest, and that's not necessarily the case. And again, as we talked about before, champion trees are not necessarily huge trees, depending on the species. So there's a lot of variety in those champions that Virginia has, I would imagine.
Yes, and one of the problems that we have, quite frankly, is some of the smaller stature trees can be state and national champions, and they can be sitting out on the landscape, and people overlook them, and sometimes they get cut down because nobody knows that they're really significant trees.
For example, the state champion serviceberry is a small tree, genetically small, so even the biggest one is not a huge tree, but it's the biggest for its species.
And that one is in the book, and it's also a national champion, so it's the biggest in the country.
And that gets to another category that you talk about, noteworthy species, in terms of trees that aren't necessarily the biggest or even the brightest, but just ones that define an area, and red buds come to mind, and you want to talk about that.
We looked all over for our original vision, did have featuring only individual trees in these categories, but then we started thinking about redbuds and dogwoods that are really more beautiful in repetition than they are as individual specimens. So we decided we'd look for just a wonderful area that showcased redbud or dogwood, and we chose Dogwood Lane at the State Arboretum in Blandy, and then redbuds. Honestly, we looked all over for the best place to photograph redbuds. One of the best places is along I-81, and Bob actually considered trying to get out of the car and getting those wonderful cliffs along I-81, the road cuts, which are full of blooming redbuds in late March, early April. But the ones we featured some in Albemarle County that are on a beautiful country road, the way they usually are, sort of along the edge of a woodland, those wonderful pink to purple flowers, and so that's what we did with redbud and dogwood.
Well, and you mentioned along the cuts, and this combination of this beautiful color of the redbuds contrasting against the limestone, the grayish limestone, especially on a wet day. I mean, that's what always attracts me to those views.
It's wonderful.
But I know there's one chapter, you try to give kind of all the trees every credit you can, but there's a chapter on oaks, because oaks are such a part of our lives. And I do want to, since we're videotaping this in Blacksburg, want to mention the oak in Blacksburg. Jeff, can you talk about that one?
Well, do we put that in the Mighty Oaks or the community tree?
That's in the Mighty Oaks.
Okay, because it could have fit in so many different categories, and that's one of the reasons why we included it, because it was so versatile, and we could have placed it in any one of 3 or 4 different chapters.
Right.
And I wish I could remember all the details, like the name of the street and the name of the lady who lives there.
Aiken and Preston.
Okay,
That's
Aiken and
right.
Preston. Mrs. McCann, thank you so much.
McCann, that's right.
I can tell you all about the trees, and it's hard for me to remember all the other details. But I mean, that tree is large. It's, I think, only the 26th largest white oak in the state, but still we have so many that are nominated that in itself is very remarkable. But Mrs. McCann describes it as the tree is her air conditioner. That was one thing that we liked about it. and Mrs. McCann's husband was involved with Heidi Tidies, which is the band of the Corps Cadets here at Virginia Tech, and they practice in front of that tree. The neighborhood has parties in front of the tree, and it's even appeared in one of the New York newspapers in an advertisement, which we didn't know until we actually interviewed Mrs. McCann for the book. And what else can I say?
It's just a beautiful tree.
And the photo is one of the Heidi Tidies in front of the tree.
Right.
Rather dwarfed by the tree, I might
That's
say.
right. And last night there were 5 tuba players in front of the tree as they were practicing.
That's a little hard. It's hard to. Big trees just don't show up in photographs. You often have to put something in there to provide scale. And unfortunately, when you put a person in it, the human eye tends to go to the person instead of the tree. So that was sort of a tension in this whole process. What can you put in there to provide scale that doesn't upstage the trees?
Well, and then when there's a photo of a cat with the tree.
Right.
I really like that one.
Well, I had to entice him over with part of Bob's turkey sandwich to get him over there. But yeah, the cat was good. Somebody said that's either a huge tree or a very small cat.
One of the chapters, and it talks about tree places, and obviously there's national forests and parks and that sort of thing, but cemeteries, and the photo in the book where there's the tombstone basically now surrounded by the tree.
That's in Fincastle.
But I think, to me, places like Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond and other cemeteries where the trees have been there, have been preserved before the cemeteries were even started, and just provide the historical background for why the cemeteries are there, I guess. What other places do you think about when you think about tree places?
Well, the whole issue is, where do we have places that trees can be unmolested for 500 or 600 years? Where a slow-growing tree can reach maturity, and cemeteries are one. I mean, we really do. And cemeteries are wonderful because Hollywood Cemetery, for example, is open every day of the year, dawn to dusk, free. It's so easy to go in there and see them. College campuses are another wonderful place to see trees. The Tech campus is wonderful, William and Mary, University of Mary Washington, wonderful trees at Sweetbriar. College campuses, particularly if they have an arborist and a good horticulture program, can be wonderful for trees. And then we talk about state and national forests, some natural areas like Caledon in King George County.
Right on the Potomac River.
That was one that I just happened to read about in a Native Plant Society newsletter, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And it's a mature beech forest that is just gorgeous. And again, it's anybody can go there, visit any day of the year, open dawn to dusk, free, and here's this beautiful mature beech forest on the Potomac.
And we were talking before we started taping. I wanted to ask each of you your favorite trees, and beeches are among your favorites.
Beeches in my top 3. They're just so beautiful. That's a tree that we featured in Noteworthy Species, I believe, because there was just so much to say about the beech. And I don't know, there's a gorgeous one in Falls Church. That's the one of the ones we featured in front of a church, and down at the bottom of the hill, thousands of cars drive by there every day, but very few people know that tree's at the top of the hill. So.
Yeah. And Jeff, for you, hickories, I guess, are at the top of your list.
Well, right now, in listening to Nancy talk, my PhD dissertation was on beech trees, and so obviously I've been very interested in them in the past. But right now, I am very much interested in trees that I think were part of an American Indian horticulture, particularly those here in the Southeast. And so hickory is one of them. Hickory is actually an Algonquian word, because the Europeans did not have a name for it when they arrived here. It was a very important food source. The nuts were smashed, and then together with the nut meats, they were boiled, and the nut meats would rise to the top, and so would the oils, and a very nutritious food was made out of it called hicora, and so or poor hicorora, or something to that effect. And the name of the tree lasts to this day. And then the other thing about hickory, which is so important for me, is that very few people call attention to it. I literally had to get on the phone and ask people to nominate hickories. Right. So when you go and see the few hickories that were nominated to our project, most of those were at my urging.
Well, the one I specifically want to mention is the shagbark hickory, because I think the picture in the book really tells the story about what shagbark hickories are. This appearance of this bark that looks like it's going to fall off, and yet that's the way the tree functions. And it's a spectacular example down in Southwest Virginia, far Southwest Virginia, I believe.
Right.
Yes, there are also some wonderful shagbark hickories at Oatlands in Leesburg, but they have to get old for that bark to begin to peel off in long strips and curl up. But it's quite a hairdo.
This has been obviously a long process to get this book published, University of Virginia Press. And again, I want to give credit to Robert Llewellyn as much as I can for the outstanding photographs. But now that the book is finished, what do you hope comes out of this? And Jeff, let me start with you. I know this sort of arose from working with kids in the 4-H program, and I would guess that'd be part of the legacy of the book that you'd like to see.
Right. Well, there were two overarching goals. One was to document these trees in the first place. Let's find out where they are and what stories they tell. But the second overarching goal was to engage a new generation in the care and appreciation of trees. And so in many ways, I feel like the work is really just beginning for me, because I want to talk about these trees with school children and 4-H clubs and youth groups wherever I can reach them.
And Nancy, the same question to you. I know you said in a recent presentation that one point you want to get across is trees are good, but it goes much beyond that, doesn't it?
Right. I think lots of times we think of trees as the background against which human activity takes place, and we want to move them to the foreground and make people think of trees not just as ornaments or as background material, but as real workhorses in terms of what they do for the environment, and to pay attention to individual trees. Another thing that I'm particularly eager to do is to try to encourage people where they can to plant long-lived, often slow-growing legacy trees as opposed to faster-growing ornamentals, because if we're going to have these kinds of trees coming along for future generations, somebody's got to protect those spots and plant those trees with the genetic potential to live a long time.
That sounds like a good place to start by stop by looking towards the future. Our guests have been Jeff Kirwan, forestry professor and extension specialist at Virginia Tech, and Nancy Ross Hugo, outdoor writer and co-author of Remarkable Trees of Virginia, photographs by Robert Llewellyn, University of Virginia Press. Thank you both for joining us for this discussion, and I want to thank our audience for joining us. Have a good day.
Think forward. Think Research Channel.